Tonight, we're diving deep into Oakridge, Oregon. Most horror channels scatter their stories across different places, but we do things a little differently here. We've learned that when darkness takes root in a town, it doesn't just leave, it spreads, it echoes, it waits. Oakridge may seem like an ordinary logging town in the Cascade Mountains, but the locals know better. They avoid certain places: Tire Mountain Trail, Salmon Creek Reservoir, and the old mill ruins. If you ask why, they'll give you that knowing look and say, if the forest goes quiet, don't stop moving. Tonight, we're sharing 5 true accounts of people who ignored those warnings and ventured into what should have been ordinary places. They thought they were safe: trail running, wildlife photography, mushroom foraging, and more. But in Oakridge, nothing is ever quite as it seems. By the end of tonight, you'll understand why some towns should be left alone. Subscribe before we dive deep into our stories today. Let's begin. Jake Brennan was the kind of trail runner who lived for isolation. At 29, he'd logged over 2,000 miles on mountain trails across the Pacific Northwest. Mount Hood, Mount Rainier, the Columbia River Gorge. He wasn't interested in city marathons or track records. He wanted altitude, forests, and trails where he'd go hours without seeing another human being. In late September 2017, Jake moved to Eugene, Oregon for a software engineering job. Within days, he'd mapped out every trail system within a 2-hour drive. Oakridge kept appearing in his research, specifically Tire Mountain Trail. 14 miles round trip, 3,000 feet of elevation gain, dense old-growth forest. Perfect. What Jake didn't notice during his research was the absence of recent trail reviews. The AllTrails page had comments from 2008, 2012, and then nothing. No photos, no check-ins. Jake drove to Oakridge on a Friday morning, September 29th. The sky was overcast, typical for the season. He parked at the Tire Mountain Trailhead around 7:00 a.m., the only vehicle in the lot. He stretched, checked his GPS watch, and noted his heart rate, 52 BPM, resting, calm. The trail started gently, winding through towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks. The forest floor was carpeted with moss and ferns. Jake fell into his rhythm, breathing steady, feet light on the dirt. The first 3 miles were perfect. No other hikers, no mountain bikers, just the sound of his footsteps and the occasional bird call. Jake checked his map. The trail was public. He kept running. That's when he noticed the silence. It wasn't a gradual shift. One moment, Jake could hear birds, crows cawing, a woodpecker hammering somewhere in the canopy. The next moment, nothing. Complete silence. Jake slowed to a jog, then a walk. He stopped, hands on his hips, catching his breath. His GPS watch showed 8:14 a.m., elevation 2,240 feet, heart rate 142 BPM, normal for the climb. But the forest felt wrong. Jake had spent hundreds of hours in the woods. He knew what silence sounded like: early morning stillness, the quiet after snowfall. This was different. This was absence. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal sounds. Even his breathing seemed muffled, like the air itself was swallowing sound. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Expected. He checked the map again. Another 6 miles to the summit, then a loop trail back. He'd come this far. Turning back felt ridiculous. Probably just the elevation, Jake muttered to himself. His voice sounded flat, dead. He started running again. The trail steepened. Jake's legs burned as he pushed up switchbacks. His watch showed his heart rate climbing, 158, 165, 172. But something else was wrong. His pace was faster than usual, yet he felt like he was barely moving forward, like running through water. At mile 6, Jake saw the first marker, a pair of hiking boots, placed side by side on a flat rock next to the trail, laces tied. No sign of a struggle, no backpack, no gear, just boots. Jake stopped. His heart hammered in his chest, not from exertion now, from something else. He called out. Nothing. He looked around. The forest pressed in on all sides, dark and impenetrable. The trail behind him looked wrong, like it had shifted, like the trees had moved closer. Jake checked his watch, 8:47 a.m. He'd been running for an hour and 47 minutes, 2 miles traveled. That didn't make sense. He should have been past 7 miles by now. He scrolled through his watch's data. His pace was listed as 9:47 per mile, but Jake never ran that slow on trails, ever. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Behind him. Jake spun around. The trail was empty, but he'd heard it. Steady footsteps, the crunch of gravel and dirt, the same rhythm as his own stride. Close, maybe 20 feet behind him. Jake called again. His voice still sounded muffled, swallowed by the unnatural silence. No response. Jake's instincts screamed at him. He'd read about this before. Hikers in the Pacific Northwest reporting the sensation of being followed, only to find nothing there. Some attributed it to mountain lions stalking prey, others to paranoia from isolation. But Jake didn't feel paranoid. He felt certain. Something was behind him. He started running again, faster now. His watch showed his heart rate spiking. 182, 187, 190. His breathing came in ragged gasps. The trail blurred beneath his feet. The footsteps matched his pace. Jake pushed harder. His quads screamed. His lungs burned. He wasn't running toward the summit anymore. He was running away. The trail began to descend, which made no sense. Jake had studied the elevation profile. Tire Mountain Trail climbed steadily for 8 miles before the summit loop. There shouldn't be any downhill sections yet. He checked his GPS watch. 9:03 a.m. 8 miles. That was impossible. 6 miles? Jake stopped, doubling over, hands on his knees. His heart rate showed 194 BPM. Dangerous territory. The footsteps behind him stopped. Jake slowly straightened, turning around. The trail behind him was gone, not obscured by fog or trees. Gone. Where there had been a clear dirt path 30 seconds ago, there was now just forest, dense undergrowth, fallen logs and ferns. Like the trail had never existed. Jake's breath caught in his throat. His GPS watch showed a blue line tracking his route. But when he looked up from the screen and back at the forest, there was no trail. He was standing on a trail that, according to reality, wasn't there. Okay, Jake whispered to himself. Okay. He turned forward again. The trail ahead was still visible, winding up into the trees. His only option was to keep moving. He took one step forward. The footsteps behind him took one step forward. Jake froze. The footsteps froze. He took another step, slowly, deliberately. The footsteps matched him. Not echoes, not his imagination. Footsteps, perfectly synchronized with his own, as if something was mirroring his movements exactly. Jake's hands trembled. He reached for his phone, fumbling with the screen. No signal. He opened the camera app anyway, holding the phone up and angling it behind him without turning around. He took the photo. The camera shutter sounded impossibly loud in the dead silence. Jake looked at the screen. The photo showed the trail behind him, clear, visible, normal. But standing in the center of the path, maybe 15 feet away, was a figure. It wasn't human. It was shaped like a person, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but its proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, the head tilted at an angle that no neck could support, and it was translucent, like smoke given form. Jake's phone slipped from his hands, hitting the dirt. He ran. Jake's vision tunneled. His legs pumped mechanically, driven by pure adrenaline. The trail twisted and turned, switchbacks that didn't match his memory of the route. Tree branches whipped past his face, drawing blood. The footsteps behind him didn't stop. They got closer. Jake could hear breathing now, wet, ragged, like lungs filled with fluid. It matched the rhythm of the footsteps. Inhale, step, exhale, step. His GPS watch vibrated. He glanced down mid-stride. Warning, heart rate 201 BPM, stop activity. Jake's chest felt like it was going to explode. His vision swam, but stopping meant letting that thing catch him. So he ran. The trail opened into a clearing. The summit, Jake thought desperately. But when he burst through the tree line, he stumbled to a halt. He was standing in the middle of the Tire Mountain Trailhead parking lot, the same place he'd started. Jake spun in a circle. His car was there, exactly where he'd parked it. The weathered trail sign was there, but his watch showed 9:19 a.m. He'd been running for over 2 hours, and the footsteps were still coming. Jake could see the trail entrance, the gap in the trees where the path began. The trees seemed to sway, though there was no wind, and then the figure stepped out of the forest. In full daylight, it was worse. It moved like a puppet with half its strings cut, limbs jerking at unnatural angles, head lolling. Its face was a blur, features shifting and indistinct, like a photograph taken while moving. But its eyes, if they were eyes, were fixed on Jake. Jake's legs gave out. He collapsed onto the gravel parking lot, gasping for air. His watch showed his heart rate dropping rapidly, 195, 180, 162, shock setting in. The figure stopped at the edge of the parking lot. It didn't step onto the gravel. It just stood there, swaying slightly, as if held back by an invisible barrier. Jake's survival instincts kicked in. He crawled toward his car, hand trembling as he reached for his pocket. Keys! Where were his keys? The figure tilted its head, watching. Jake found his keys, fumbled with the unlock button. The car beeped. He yanked the door open, threw himself inside, slammed it shut. His hands shook so violently he could barely get the key into the ignition. The figure took one step forward onto the gravel, then another. Jake turned the key. The engine roared to life. He threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on gravel. The figure moved toward him, not running, gliding, covering distance impossibly fast. Jake shifted into drive and floored it. In his rearview mirror, the figure stood in the center of the parking lot, motionless. And then, as Jake's car rounded the bend onto the highway, it turned and walked back into the forest. Jake drove straight through Oakridge without stopping. He didn't stop in Eugene. He didn't stop until he reached his apartment in Portland 3 hours later. 8 miles. Duration, 2 hours, 19 minutes. Elevation gain, sun, 1,240 feet. But Jake had been on that trail. He'd climbed miles of switchbacks. He'd run for what felt like hours. The data made no sense. Jake pulled up his photo gallery. His hands still shook as he scrolled to the photo he'd taken on the trail, the one showing the figure behind him. The photo showed only the trail, empty. Jake deleted the image anyway. He called in sick to work for 3 days. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the footsteps. He researched Tire Mountain Trail obsessively, finding fragments of information buried in forum posts and old news archives. That's when he found the articles. November 1989, hiker missing on Tire Mountain Trail. Last seen at trailhead, 7:00 a.m. Car found in parking lot. Boots discovered on trail. Laces tied. March 1995, search suspended for missing campers. 2 pairs of shoes found on Tire Mountain Trail. No other evidence. August 2003, trail runner disappears. GPS watch recovered, showing impossibly slow pace and contradictory elevation data. Jake stopped researching. 3 weeks later, Jake heard about a photographer named Elise Moreno who'd gone missing in the Willamette National Forest. Her car was found at a trailhead 5 miles from Oakridge. Her camera equipment was discovered on an abandoned logging road, neatly arranged. No sign of Elise. Jake didn't run trails anymore. He stuck to city parks, paved paths, places with crowds, and on November nights, when the wind picked up and the trees outside his apartment swayed, he'd hear it again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps, the same rhythm, the same pace, following him. Later, Jake would learn about what happened to Elise Moreno on that logging road. He'd learn about a mushroom forager who found something in the dead Fir Grove that he wished he hadn't. He'd learn about the kayaker who disappeared on Salmon Creek Reservoir and the urban explorer who walked into the old mill ruins and never came out. All of them in Oakridge, all of them within 5 miles of where Jake had run, and all of them reported the same thing before they vanished. The forest went silent, and something started following them. Jake moved to Seattle 6 months later. He never went back to Oregon, but sometimes, late at night, he'd check the AllTrails page for Tire Mountain Trail. Jake never ran trails again. Elise Moreno had been photographing wildlife professionally for 8 years. Her work had appeared in National Geographic, Audubon magazine, and Sierra Club calendars. At 34, she'd built a reputation for patience, spending hours, sometimes days, waiting for the perfect shot of elk, owls, or black bears in their natural habitat. In October 2017, Elise was commissioned to photograph Roosevelt elk during the rutting season in Oregon's Cascade Range. The assignment paid well, and the timing was perfect. She packed her Canon 5D Mark IV, 3 telephoto lenses, and camping gear into her Subaru Outback and drove from her home in Bend, Oregon, to the Willamette National Forest. Oakridge was the closest town with a grocery store and gas station. Elise stopped at the Cascade Market on Highway 58 to stock up on supplies. As she loaded her car, an older man, maybe 60, wearing a faded logging company cap, approached her. "You're not from around here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Just passing through," Elise replied politely. The man's expression darkened. Elise pulled out her map, pointing to a section of forest north of Salmon Creek Reservoir, planning to camp off Kitson Hot Springs Road. The man stared at the map, then at Elise. "Don't care what your map says. That road's closed." Elise smiled tightly. She got in her car and drove away. In her rearview mirror, the old man stood in the parking lot watching her leave. Elise found Kitson Hot Springs Road exactly where her map indicated, a dirt turnoff from Forest Road 19, barely visible through overgrown brush. A rusted metal gate blocked vehicle access, but there was enough room to park on the shoulder. The road itself was in decay. Saplings grew through cracks in the dirt. Ferns had reclaimed the edges, but Elise could see the elk tracks in the mud, fresh within the last day. She shouldered her camera bag and tripod, walking up the old logging road. The forest was dense as here, Douglas fir, western red cedar, and vine maple, creating a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting wood. After about a mile, Elise spotted what she was looking for: rub marks on tree trunks, bull elk scraping their antlers, marking territory. She was in the right place. She set up her camera on the tripod, positioning herself downwind behind a fallen log. Then she waited. Photography was meditation for Elise. She could sit motionless for hours, breathing slowly, becoming part of the landscape. Animals sense movement, noise, and anxiety. If you stilled yourself completely, they'd walk right past you. An hour passed. The forest was alive with sound: crows calling, squirrels chattering, the distant rush of a creek. Elise's breathing fell into rhythm with the surroundings. Then she heard it, the bugling call of a bull elk. Elise's heart rate spiked, but she forced herself to stay calm. 6. Shutter speed 1/500. Through her telephoto lens, she scanned the forest. Movement. 50 yards ahead, a massive bull elk stepped onto the logging road. 6-point antlers, easily 700 pounds. Magnificent. Elise pressed the shutter. Click, click, click. The elk's head snapped toward her. It shouldn't have heard the camera. Elise was too far away, and modern DSLRs were nearly silent. But the elk stared directly at her, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Then it bolted. Elise lowered her camera, confused. She'd done everything right. Wind direction, distance, silence. There was no reason for the elk to spook, unless something else had spooked it. Elise scanned the forest through her lens. That's when she saw it. Standing in the trees, maybe 30 yards behind where the elk had been, was a figure. At first, Elise thought it was another photographer, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, partially obscured by tree trunks, facing her direction. Elise called out. No response. Elise felt a prickle of unease. She looked through her camera lens again, zooming in. The figure was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, and impossibly thin. Its clothes, if they were clothes, blended into the surrounding trees, making it hard to distinguish where the figure ended and the forest began. Elise lowered her camera and stood up, waving. "Hey!" The figure didn't move. Elise's unease deepened into something colder. She checked her watch. 4:47 p.m. The sun would set in less than an hour. She needed to get back to her car before dark. She packed up her camera gear quickly, glancing over her shoulder. The figure was still there, motionless. Elise started walking back down the logging road, her pace faster than before. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Elise stopped walking. The footsteps stopped. She turned around slowly. The logging road behind her was empty, but she'd heard them, distinct footsteps, the crunch of gravel and sticks, not animal sounds, human footsteps. "This isn't funny," Elise called out, her voice sharper now. Silence. Elise resumed walking, her hand gripping the strap of her camera bag. The road seemed longer than she remembered. The light was fading fast, filtering through the canopy in weak gray shafts. The footsteps resumed behind her. Closer this time. Elise walked faster. Her heart hammered in her chest. She'd been in remote locations before: Alaska, Montana, the Amazon. She knew how to handle dangerous wildlife, but this felt different. This felt like being hunted. She pulled out her phone, no signal, expected this deep in the forest. Her car was still at least half a mile away. Elise broke into a jog. The footsteps behind her matched her pace, but she risked a glance over her shoulder. The figure was on the road now, not running, but moving, gliding. Its limbs didn't swing naturally. They hung at its sides, limp and elongated, yet it was covering ground impossibly fast. Elise ran. Her camera bag bounced painfully against her hip. The tripod strapped to her back clanged with every stride. She didn't care. She just needed to reach her car. The logging road curved ahead. Elise rounded the bend and stopped. The road was blocked. A massive Douglas fir had fallen across the path, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. Elise hadn't passed this tree on the way in. She would have remembered it, but it was there now. Elise spun around. The figure was 30 feet behind her, standing in the center of the road. Up close, it was worse. Its face was a void. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, blank surface where features should be. Its hands were too long, fingers tapering into points, and it was translucent, like fog that had taken shape. Elise's hands shook as she fumbled with her camera. Some primal instinct told her to document this, to capture proof of what she was seeing. She raised the camera and pressed the shutter. The figure reacted. Its head snapped to the side as if struck. Then it moved toward her, not gliding now, but jerking forward in rapid, unnatural movements, like a video skipping frames. Elise screamed. She dropped her camera and scrambled over the fallen tree, thorns and branches tearing at her clothes. On the other side, she ran blindly into the forest, off the road, crashing through the undergrowth. Branches whipped her face. Roots caught her feet. She fell hard, landing on her hands and knees in the mud. Blood dripped from a cut on her forehead. Behind her, she heard it coming. Not footsteps now, something worse, a sound like breathing, but wet and ragged, echoing from all directions. Elise forced herself to her feet and kept running. She burst through a thicket and stumbled into a clearing. The old Kitson Hot Springs. Elise had read about this place. The springs had been a popular destination in the 1960s, but the road had been abandoned after several drownings. The pools were still there, 3 stone-lined basins filled with steaming, sulfurous water. And standing around the pools, like statues, were more figures. 6 of them, 7, 10, all identical, tall, thin, faceless, watching her. Elise's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing. One of the figures moved toward her. Elise closed her eyes, waiting for the end, but nothing happened. She opened her eyes slowly. The figures were still there, surrounding the hot springs, but they hadn't moved closer. They stood at the edge of the clearing, as if held back by an invisible boundary. Elise's photographer instincts kicked in, overriding her terror. She reached into her jacket pocket. Her phone was still there. No signal, but the camera worked. She raised the phone and took a photo. The figures reacted simultaneously, all of them jerking backward as if struck. The closest one flickered, like static on an old TV, then solidified again. Elise's mind raced. Light. They reacted to light, specifically the camera flash. She took another photo. The figures recoiled again. One of them at the far end of the clearing dissolved entirely, vanishing into the air. Elise got to her feet, her hands trembling. She started walking backward, away from the hot springs, toward the tree line. She kept her phone raised, finger on the shutter button. The figures followed, but slowly, cautiously. Elise took photo after photo, the flash strobing in the darkening forest. Each time, the figures flickered, fading slightly. She reached the trees and turned, running again. Behind her, the wet, ragged breathing resumed. But Elise knew where she was now. She'd crossed through the forest at an angle. If she kept moving west, she'd hit the main forest road eventually. She ran for what felt like hours, though her phone showed only 20 minutes had passed. The forest grew darker. The breathing behind her never stopped. And then, through the trees, she saw it. Her car. Elise sprinted the last 100 yards, fumbling for her keys. She unlocked the door, threw herself inside, and locked it behind her. The breathing stopped. Elise sat in the driver's seat, hyperventilating, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the steering wheel. She looked out the windshield. The figures were standing at the tree line, maybe 20 feet from her car. All of them, a dozen or more, their translucent forms barely visible in the fading light. They didn't move. They just watched. Elise started the engine and drove. Elise drove straight to the sheriff's office in Oakridge. The deputy on duty listened to her story with a neutral expression, taking notes. When she finished, he sighed. "Ma'am, Kitson Hot Springs Road has been closed since 1997. The deputy leaned back in his chair. Elise pulled out her phone, scrolling through her camera roll. She pulled up the first image, the one she'd taken of the bull elk. The photo showed the elk clearly, but in the background, partially obscured by trees, was one of the figures. Tall, thin, translucent. The deputy's expression didn't change. "That's not a tree." Elise scrolled to the next photo, the one she'd taken when the figure was closer. The image was blurry, overexposed by the flash, but the shape was clearly humanoid. The deputy stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he handed her phone back. "Ma'am, I'm going to give you some advice. Don't go back up there. If you left any gear behind, consider it lost, because people go missing in those woods." He paused. Elise left the sheriff's office feeling more unsettled than before. She drove to a motel in Eugene, 40 miles west. She didn't sleep that night. She reviewed every photo on her camera's SD card, the one from her professional camera, which she'd dropped during her escape. She never got the camera back. 3 days later, Elise received an email from an unknown sender. No text, just an attachment. It was a photo. Her camera sitting on a moss-covered log in the middle of Kitson Hot Springs Road. The lens was cracked, but the camera was still on, the LCD screen glowing, and displayed on the screen was a photo Elise didn't remember taking. It was a selfie, but it wasn't her face in the frame. It was one of the figures, standing directly behind her, its faceless head tilted down toward the camera. Elise deleted the email. She sold all her camera equipment 2 weeks later and quit wildlife photography. She never went back to Oregon, but sometimes, late at night, she'd wake up to the sound of a camera shutter clicking, and when she'd check her phone in the morning, there'd be new photos in her gallery. Photos she didn't take, photos of forests, of logging roads, of figures standing just outside the frame, always watching. Later, Elise would hear about a trail runner named Jake, who had a similar experience on Tire Mountain Trail. She'd hear about a mushroom forager who found something in the dead Fir Grove, and she'd hear about the urban explorer who walked into the old mill ruins and never came out. All of them in Oakridge, all of them within 5 miles of Kitson Hot Springs Road, and all of them reported the same thing. The forest went silent, and something started following them. Elise moved to New York City. She never photographed nature again. Marcus Chen had been foraging wild mushrooms since he was 7 years old. Growing up in Portland with a father who'd immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s, Marcus learned to identify fungi the way other kids learned to ride bikes or throw baseballs. His father, a trained botanist who'd worked for Taiwan's Forestry Service, treated mushroom foraging like a sacred art, part science, part intuition, part respect for the forest ecosystem. By age 35, Marcus could distinguish between 200-plus species by sight, smell, texture, and even the way they bruised when touched. He knew which mushrooms were choice edibles, which were medicinal, which were mildly toxic, and which were deadly. He turned this knowledge into a small but profitable business, supplying high-end restaurants in Portland with chanterelles, morels, porcini, and matsutake. Chefs paid premium prices for wild mushrooms, sometimes $40 per pound for fresh chanterelles, $80 for morels. In a good season, Marcus could clear $30,000 just from foraging. October was prime mushroom season in the Pacific Northwest. After the first autumn rains, the forests exploded with growth. Marcus had a circuit of reliable spots, secret locations he'd scouted over years, places where he knew certain species fruited reliably. The Columbia River Gorge for chanterelles, the Coast Range for bolets, Mount Hood for matsutake growing in association with Douglas fir roots. But in mid-October 2018, a fellow forager named Tom Rivera tipped Marcus off about a new location. They'd met at a mycology conference in Eugene, bonding over shared stories of close calls with false morels and debates about the edibility of certain Amanita species. "There's a grove of dead firs off Forest Road 5852 near Oakridge," Tom had said over beers. "Trees died back in '91, some kind of root disease, I think, but the forest floor is loaded with king boletes. I'm talking clusters of 6, 7 mushrooms." Marcus was skeptical. 40 pounds of king bolets in one day was extraordinary. "Why are you telling me?" Tom's expression had darkened. "Because I'm not going back. Something about that place felt wrong." He trailed off, shaking his head. Marcus drove down to Oakridge on October 18th, a Thursday morning. The weather was perfect. Overcast skies, temperatures in the mid-50s, recent rain, ideal mushroom conditions. He packed his gathering basket, foraging knife, field guide, bug spray, and lunch into his day pack. He found Forest Road 5852 exactly where Tom had described, a gravel Forest Service road branching off Highway 58. Marcus parked at a pullout and hiked into the forest, following his GPS coordinates. Within 20 minutes, he found the dead fir grove. It was exactly as Tom had described, but somehow more unsettling in person. A perfect circle of dead Douglas firs, maybe 50 trees, all standing like gray skeletons against the living green forest surrounding them. No needles, no bark, just bare wood, bleached white by years of weather exposure. The trees formed a ring, maybe 200 feet in diameter. Marcus had seen diseased tree stands before. Bark beetle infestations could kill entire hillsides, but this was different. The symmetry was too perfect, and the boundary was too sharp, living forest on one side, dead grove on the other, with almost no transition zone. Still, the forest floor was incredible. King bolets everywhere. Their smooth brown caps gleamed in the filtered light, some the size of salad plates. Chanterelles glowed golden in clusters. Hedgehog mushrooms, their undersides covered in delicate white spines, grew in fairy rings. This was a forager's paradise. Marcus set down his basket and got to work. He moved methodically, spiraling inward from the outer edge of the grove toward the center. He used his knife to cut mushrooms cleanly at the base, leaving the mycelium network undisturbed underground, so they'd fruit again next year. His father had drilled this into him. Never pull mushrooms, always cut. Respect the organism. Within an hour, Marcus's basket was half full. At this rate, he'd have 30 pounds by mid-afternoon, enough to supply 3 restaurants for a week, maybe earn $800. He photographed some of the larger specimens with his phone, documenting sizes. Some of these king boletes were exceptional, probably 8-9 inches across. But as Marcus worked deeper into the grove, he noticed something odd. The mushrooms weren't randomly distributed. They were arranged in lines, not perfectly straight but organized, following patterns beneath the soil, like they were tracing the roots of the dead trees underground. Marcus had never seen mushrooms grow in such obvious patterns. Even in cultivated mushroom farms, the distribution was more random than this. It was as if something was guiding their growth, channeling them along specific paths. He continued toward the center of the grove, his curiosity overriding his unease. The mushrooms here were larger, older. Some had caps that had begun to flatten and turn upward at the edges, a sign they were past prime eating quality, but were impressive specimens nonetheless. At the exact center of the grove, Marcus stopped. There was a depression in the ground, circular, maybe 6 feet in diameter. The earth had sunken inward like something had collapsed beneath it. The depression was subtle, maybe 18 inches deep at the center, but unmistakable. And growing around the edges of the depression were mushrooms Marcus didn't recognize. They were pale, almost translucent, with elongated stems that looked too delicate to support their small, bell-shaped caps. The gills were visible through the translucent tissue, dark lines like veins. Marcus knelt down, pulling out his field guide. He flipped through the pages, checking every family, every genus. Nothing matched. The morphology was wrong for any species he knew. The translucent tissue was reminiscent of Mycena species, small, delicate mushrooms that grew on rotting wood. But these were much larger, and they were growing directly from soil, not wood. Marcus took photos from multiple angles, making notes on his phone about gill attachment, spore print color, impossible to determine without collecting a specimen and waiting hours, and habitat. Then, carefully, he used his knife to cut one of the unknown mushrooms at the base. He placed it in a separate paper bag, labeling it with the date and location. He'd send photos to Dr. Patricia Kwan, a mycologist friend in Seattle who specialized in taxonomy. As Marcus stood up, he noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a sour, organic odor. Not the pleasant, earthy scent of decomposing leaves. This was sharper, acrid, like rotting meat. Marcus looked around, expecting to find a dead animal nearby, deer or elk that had died and been scavenged by coyotes, but the smell was coming from the depression. He stepped closer, peering into the sunken earth. The soil was unnaturally dark, almost black and wet despite several days without rain. The pale mushrooms grew down into the depression, their stems disappearing into the soil. And then Marcus saw the hand. It was small, partially buried in the black soil at the edge of the depression, skeletal, bones white against the dark earth, fingers curled inward as if grasping something. Marcus stumbled backward, his basket tipping over. Mushrooms spilled across the ground, his heart hammered in his chest. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, no signal. Of course. He was deep in the national forest, surrounded by mountains, no cell towers for miles. Marcus stared at the hand. It was real, not a root, not a branch, a human hand, child size, based on the scale. He needed to get to his car, drive to Oakridge, call the sheriff, report this. This was a crime scene, a burial site. Someone had died here, or been killed here. Marcus turned to leave, his breath coming in short gasps. The dead Fir Grove had changed. The trees, which had been spaced maybe 15 feet apart when he'd entered, now felt closer. The gaps between them seemed narrower. The dead wood pressed in on all sides, creating a claustrophobic feeling that hadn't been there before. Marcus walked quickly toward where he'd entered the grove, but after 30 feet, he was still surrounded by dead trees. The grove wasn't this big. He should have reached the living forest by now. He walked faster, almost jogging. His boots crunched on dead pine needles and rotting wood. 50 feet, still surrounded by dead firs. Marcus stopped, forcing himself to think logically. Disorientation was common in forests. Trees all looked similar. Overcast skies made it hard to judge direction, but his phone had a compass app. He pulled it out. North was uphill. His car was parked north of the grove. He followed the compass bearing, pushing through ferns and undergrowth. 5 minutes later, Marcus emerged into the dead fir grove. The same depression in the center, the same skeletal hand reaching from the black soil. He'd walked in a circle. Marcus tried again. East this time. Compass bearing held steady. He walked in a straight line, careful to maintain his direction. 3 minutes later, dead fir grove. Same location. West, same result. South, same result. Marcus's breath came in panicked gasps now. He wasn't lost. He couldn't be lost. The grove was maybe 200 yards across at most. There was no way to keep ending up back at the same spot. But he was trapped. Marcus forced himself to calm down. He pulled up his phone's GPS. The map showed his location clearly. A blue dot sitting on Forest Road 5852, exactly where he'd parked. But when Marcus looked up, all he saw were trees. The GPS was wrong, or reality was wrong. Marcus walked to the center of the grove, back to the depression. He needed to think, to plan, to understand what was happening. The hand had moved. Marcus froze. The skeletal hand, which had been palm down in the soil, was now palm up, fingers extended as if reaching for something, as if beckoning. Marcus took a step back. This wasn't real. Hands didn't move. Not skeletal hands, not without muscles, tendons, ligaments. The hand twitched. The fingers curled slowly, bones grinding audibly against each other. Marcus ran. He didn't care about direction anymore. He just ran, crashing through the undergrowth. Branches tearing at his face and arms. His basket and knife were gone, dropped somewhere behind him. The forest blurred around him. His lungs burned. But Marcus didn't stop. He slammed into something invisible, not a tree, not a physical object, a barrier, like running full speed into a wall of cold air. The impact knocked the wind out of him. Marcus bounced backward, landing hard on the ground. He gasped for air, his head spinning. He reached forward, feeling the air in front of him. His fingers encountered resistance, something solid but intangible, a boundary. Marcus got to his feet, following the invisible barrier with his hands. It formed a perfect circle around the dead Fir Grove. He was inside something, a cage, made of air and intention, and something Marcus couldn't begin to understand. And in the center of the grove, the depression was growing. The sunken earth was spreading outward, consuming the forest floor inch by inch. The pale mushrooms grew faster, their stems elongating in real time, caps unfurling like opening umbrellas. Marcus watched in horror as more shapes emerged from the black soil. Not just one hand, dozens of them, adult hands, child hands, fingers clawing upward, pulling bodies slowly, inexorably from the earth. Beneath them, Marcus could see skulls, ribs, leg bones, all tangled together in the black soil. This wasn't a collapsed sinkhole. This was a grave, a mass grave, and the pale mushrooms weren't just growing on the bodies. They were growing from them. Stems emerging from eye sockets, from open mouths, from the spaces between ribs. The fungi were feeding on decay, drawing nutrients from death. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hands trembling. A text message, but that was impossible. He had no signal. Marcus stared at the screen. "I can't," he typed back with shaking fingers. Another message appeared immediately. "Fire! Fire!" Marcus didn't have matches. He didn't carry a lighter. He had nothing. He checked his pockets frantically. Wallet, keys, his foraging knife. No, he'd dropped that. And then his fingers found it. A small plastic Bic lighter he'd picked up at a gas station weeks ago and forgotten about. Marcus pulled it out, flicking the ignition wheel. A small flame flickered to life. The pale mushrooms recoiled, their stems curled away from the heat, twisting like living things. Marcus's mind raced. Mushrooms were flammable when dry, but these were fresh, moist. They wouldn't burn easily. Unless... Marcus looked at the dead firs. Decades of sun exposure, dry wood, standing timber, they'd burn. He walked to the nearest dead tree, his hands shaking so badly he could barely control the lighter. He held the flame to a patch of loose bark at the base of the trunk. The bark smoked, resisting at first. Then slowly, a small flame caught and began to spread. Marcus moved to the next tree, and the next. He circled the grove, lighting fires at the base of every dead fir he could reach. The flames climbed higher, crackling and roaring. Black smoke rose into the gray sky. The pale mushrooms in the depression writhed, their stems twisted and blackened. The hands clawing from the soil stopped moving, and Marcus felt it, the invisible barrier dissolving, the cage opening. He didn't question it, he just ran. Marcus burst out of the dead fir grove and onto Forest Road 5852. His car was 50 yards away. He sprinted to it, threw himself inside, and drove. In his rearview mirror, he could see smoke rising, a black column against the gray sky. The dead fir grove was burning. David Park had been kayak fishing for 15 years, ever since his divorce at age 27. The sport had become more than a hobby. It was therapy, meditation, and escape all rolled into one. At 42, David had refined his technique to an art. Lightweight sit-on-top kayak, minimalist gear, stealthy paddling, precise casts into structure-rich zones where bass and trout congregated. No motor noise, no crowds, just him, the water, and whatever was beneath the surface. David had fished lakes across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, always chasing the next untapped honey hole. He kept meticulous records: water temperature, time of day, moon phase, lure selection, catch rates. His fishing journal filled 3 notebooks, thousands of entries documenting 15 years of pursuing freshwater fish from a kayak. In early November 2018, David stumbled across a forum post on a Pacific Northwest fishing website. The post was from 2009, written by someone named Fly Fisher PDX. Caught a 12-pound rainbow trout at Salmon Creek Reservoir near Oakridge. Biggest trout of my life. Launched at dawn, fished the North Shore structure. Water was cold, but fish were aggressive. 12 pounds. For a rainbow trout, that was massive. Most Oregon reservoirs produce fish in the 2 to 4 pound range. A 12-pounder was trophy territory. What caught David's attention was the follow-up comment, posted 3 weeks later by the same user. Don't fish Salmon Creek. I went back 3 times, never caught another fish, never saw another boat. That place is wrong. Trust me. David was intrigued. What made someone catch a trophy fish and then warn others to stay away? He researched Salmon Creek Reservoir. It was small, maybe 40 acres, fed by snowmelt from the Cascades, stocked with rainbow trout in the 1970s by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, then largely forgotten. The reservoir wasn't managed anymore, no active stocking program, but self-sustaining populations of wild trout, sometimes developed in lakes like this. David loaded his fishing kayak, a 12-foot Hobie with a pedal drive system, onto his truck and drove to Oakridge on November 8th. He arrived at dawn, the sky just beginning to lighten from black to deep blue. The access road to Salmon Creek Reservoir was barely maintained, rutted and potholed. David's truck bounced and scraped over rocks. The launch area was nothing more than a dirt ramp sloping into the water. No other vehicles, no facilities, no signs of recent use. Perfect. David unloaded his kayak, rigged his rods, and launched into the glassy water. The reservoir was perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. David's fish finder showed depths between 20 and 60 feet, deeper than he'd expected for a small reservoir. He pedaled slowly along the north shore, watching his sonar for structure, submerged logs, rock piles, depth changes, anywhere fish might congregate. Within minutes, his sonar lit up with fish arcs. David smiled. This was going to be a good day. He tied on a jig, a 1/4 ounce tungsten head with a white paddle tail, and cast toward a submerged log showing on his sonar. The jig sank. David let it hit bottom at 35 feet, then began a slow retrieve, bouncing it along the lake bed. Strike. The rod bent hard. David set the hook with a sharp upward jerk, feeling solid weight on the other end. The fish ran, peeling line from his reel. David kept pressure steady, not forcing the fight, but not giving slack either. 30 seconds later, he netted a beautiful rainbow trout, 3 pounds, healthy and thick-bodied, wild fish. not a hatchery trout. David took a quick photo, measured the fish, 18 inches, and released it. One fish in 10 minutes. This was exactly what he'd hoped for. He caught 2 more in the next hour, both healthy, well-fed trout in the 2-3 pound range. David was in the zone, his movements automatic, cast, sink, retrieve, hook set, land, release, and then the water went silent. David didn't notice it immediately. He was focused on his line, watching the subtle twitch of his rod tip that indicated a fish mouthing the jig. But gradually, he became aware of the absence of sound. No birds, no wind, no lapping water against his kayak. Complete silence. David paused mid-retrieve, looking around. The reservoir was glassy still, but now it seemed unnaturally so. The water looked thick, almost viscous, like it had a heavier consistency than normal. He checked his fish finder. The screen showed the bottom contour clearly, 45 feet below him, but the fish arcs were gone. No bait fish, no activity, just empty water. That was odd. Moments ago, the screen had been alive with movement. Fish don't just disappear like that. David dipped his paddle into the water and stroked. The kayak glided forward, but the sensation was wrong. The water felt heavy, resistant, like paddling through gelatin. David's unease deepened. He'd fished hundreds of lakes. He knew what normal felt like. This wasn't it. He decided to head back to the launch. He'd caught 3 fish, a successful morning. No point staying if the bite had died. David turned his kayak toward shore and began pedaling. His Hobie's drive system allowed him to use his legs, leaving his hands free to fish. But now, as he pedaled, he felt unusual resistance. The kayak moved forward, but sluggishly, like the water was fighting him. David looked toward the tree line. The shore, which had been maybe 200 yards away when he'd launched, now looked distant. Maybe 400 yards, maybe more. That didn't make sense. The reservoir was small. He'd only paddled a few hundred yards from the launch, but the shore looked impossibly far now. David checked his GPS watch. It showed his position clearly. He was in the center of the reservoir, roughly 300 yards from the north shore. But visually, the shore looked at least twice that distance. David pedaled harder. His legs burned with effort. The drive system churned the water. But when he looked up after a minute of hard pedaling, the shore didn't look any closer. David stopped, breathing hard. This didn't make sense. He should have covered at least 100 yards, but the distance to shore looked unchanged. He checked his watch again, 8:42 a.m. He'd been on the water for 2 hours. His GPS track showed his route clearly, a zigzag pattern along the north shore, then a straight line toward the launch. But he wasn't moving. According to his position, he'd barely covered 50 yards in the last 5 minutes of pedaling. David's heart rate spiked. He forced himself to breathe slowly. Panic wouldn't help. There had to be an explanation. Maybe a strong headwind he couldn't feel. Maybe an underwater current. Then David saw the ripple. It started maybe 50 yards to his left, a disturbance in the otherwise glassy water. Not a splash, just a ripple, spreading outward in a perfect circle, like something massive had surfaced and submerged without breaking the surface. David scanned the water. Another ripple, this time to his right. Closer, then another behind him. The ripples appeared and disappeared in rapid succession, dozens of them, surrounding his kayak. But nothing was breaking the surface. Whatever was causing the ripples was beneath the water. David checked his fish finder. The screen was black, not malfunctioning, just blank. Like the sonar couldn't detect anything. No bottom, no fish, no structure, just an empty void beneath him. David's stomach dropped. The reservoir was 45 feet deep. The fish finder should have shown something. He turned off the device and turned it back on. The screen flickered to life. David stared at the screen. Fish finders didn't display words. They showed depth charts, fish arcs, temperature readings, not text messages. The word blinked twice, then vanished, replaced by the normal depth reading. 45 feet. David's hands shook. He dropped his fishing rod. It clattered against the kayak's hull, then slipped into the water. He reached for it instinctively and froze. The rod was sinking, slowly. But it was sinking. Fishing rods were buoyant. They floated. The cork handle, the foam grips, the sealed rod tubes, all designed to float if dropped overboard. But David's rod was descending into the dark water, disappearing from view. David grabbed his spare rod from the bungee cords on his kayak and pedaled hard toward shore. He didn't care about the fish. He didn't care about the gear. He just needed to get off this water. The kayak moved forward, but something was wrong. David could feel it, a resistance beneath him, like the water itself was thickening, becoming viscous. Each pedal stroke required more effort. The kayak slowed. David's arms burned as he paddled with his hands, trying to add speed. His legs cramped from pedaling, but the kayak barely moved, and then he felt it tilt, not rocking, tilting, like something beneath him was pulling down on one side of the kayak. David shifted his weight, trying to stabilize. The kayak leveled out momentarily, then tilted again, harder this time. David looked down into the water. There was a shadow beneath him, large, moving, not a fish, not a log, something massive, shapeless, undulating like smoke underwater. The shadow was darker than the surrounding water, like a void had opened beneath his kayak. The shadow rose. David's kayak lifted with it, the hull groaning under pressure. He was being pushed upward, out of the water, like something enormous was surfacing directly beneath him. David grabbed the sides of his kayak, his mind racing. If he capsized here, if he went into the water, he'd never make it to shore. The shadow beneath him spread wider, encompassing the entire kayak. And then David saw them. Eyes, not two, dozens, hundreds, small black, unblinking eyes, clustered together in the shadow's mass like a swarm. They were watching him. David screamed. The kayak tipped violently. David fell. He hit the water hard, the cold stealing his breath. His life jacket inflated automatically, pulling him to the surface. David gasped, treading water, his arms and legs thrashing. The shore was so far, too far. He'd never make it. The water around him was black, not dark. Black, like ink. And it was moving, swirling, creating currents that pulled at David's legs. Something brushed against his foot. David kicked wildly, his heart hammering. His kayak had flipped and was drifting away, upside down, useless. He swam, his arms carved through the water in desperate, uncoordinated strokes. His life jacket kept him afloat, but barely. The water felt thick, resistant, like swimming through syrup. Behind him, David could feel it. The presence, massive, ancient, rising from the depths. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The water was bulging, a dome of liquid, rising 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet into the air. And within the dome, David could see shapes, human shapes, bodies, floating, suspended, their faces pale and bloated, their eyes open and staring. The missing people, all of them, trapped in the water, preserved. The dome collapsed, crashing down with a sound like thunder. A wave surged forward, lifting David, carrying him. He tumbled, disoriented, his body tossed like driftwood. And then his feet hit something solid. Sand, mud, the shoreline. David crawled out of the water, his hands digging into the dirt. He collapsed on the beach, gasping for air, his body shaking uncontrollably. Behind him, the reservoir was calm, glassy, still, as if nothing had happened. Vanessa Price made a living documenting abandoned places. At 27, she ran a YouTube channel called Forgotten Spaces with 180,000 subscribers. Her content was different from typical urban exploration videos. No jump scares, no fake paranormal investigations, no clickbait. Just quiet, atmospheric cinematography of decaying factories, forgotten hospitals, ghost towns, and abandoned theme parks across America. Vanessa's approach was almost meditative. Long, slow camera movements, natural ambient sound, minimal narration. She let the locations speak for themselves. Some of her most popular uploads had millions of views. An abandoned mall in Ohio, a defunct psychiatric hospital in Pennsylvania, a mining town in Nevada slowly being swallowed by desert. In December 2018, while researching locations in Oregon, Vanessa discovered the Cascade Timber Company mill in Oakridge. The mill had burned in 1947, killing 37 workers, and had been abandoned ever since. Aerial photos from Google Earth show the skeletal remains of the structure. Rusted metal beams forming a cathedral-like framework, collapsed buildings, overgrown rail tracks leading nowhere. Perfect for her channel. Vanessa drove to Oakridge on December 14th, arriving in mid-afternoon. Winter light in the Pacific Northwest was soft and diffused, perfect for filming. She parked on Highway 58 near the mill site, grabbed her camera bag, carbon fiber tripod, and a small drone for aerial shots. The mill ruins were visible from the road, a massive industrial skeleton rising against the gray sky. Vanessa walked through the chain-link fence, long since rusted and collapsed, and into the ruins. The main building's framework still stood, towering metal beams reaching 60 feet high. Concrete foundations were cracked and overgrown with blackberry brambles and Himalayan blackberry, an invasive species that had taken over much of the site. Rusted equipment lay scattered like the bones of some mechanical beast. Circular saw blades 10 feet in diameter, conveyor belt systems, boilers big enough to walk inside. Vanessa set up her camera and began filming. She narrated quietly, describing the mill's history for her viewers. The Cascade Timber Company was the largest employer in Oakridge. At its peak in the 1940s, the mill processed over 1 million board feet of lumber per day. On November 18, 1947, a fire broke out during the night shift. 37 men died, most of them trapped behind fallen timber stacks. Survivors reported hearing screams for hours after the fire started. The mill never reopened. Vanessa moved through the ruins methodically, filming every angle. The light was perfect. Overcast skies casting even, diffused shadows. No harsh contrasts. Cinematic. She climbed carefully over a collapsed wall and entered what had been the main saw room. Rusted saw blades, each massive and circular, lay embedded in the concrete floor. Some were partially buried in decades of accumulated dirt and vegetation. Vanessa filmed them from above, creating a slow pan that captured the scale of decay. And then she heard the sound, a metallic grinding, like gears turning. Vanessa stopped filming, lowering her camera. She listened. Silence. Old buildings settled. Metal expanded and contracted with temperature changes. It was normal. Vanessa resumed filming. The grinding sound started again, louder this time, rhythmic, mechanical. Vanessa turned toward the source. The sound was coming from deeper inside the mill, from a section she hadn't explored yet, a partially collapsed building at the rear of the site. She checked her watch, 3:47 p.m. Sunset was at 4:30. She had maybe 40 minutes of good light left. Vanessa shouldered her camera bag and walked toward the sound. The grinding grew louder as she approached. She stepped through a doorway, her boots crunching on broken glass and rusted metal fragments. The grinding stopped immediately. Total silence. Vanessa froze. The sudden absence of sound was more unsettling than the noise itself. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dim interior, illuminating rusted machinery, fallen beams, and piles of debris. And then she saw the handprint. On a dusty metal panel, fresh, the oils from someone's palm leaving a clear outline. 5 fingers. An adult hand. Recent, within the last few hours. Vanessa's heart rate spiked. Someone else was here. She called out, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. No response. Vanessa examined the handprint more closely. It was recent, definitely, but she'd been the only vehicle parked on the highway. She hadn't seen anyone else. She backed away from the panel, her photographer instincts overridden by a growing sense of wrongness. She turned to leave and saw more handprints, on the walls, on the floor, on every surface within the beam of her flashlight. Dozens of them, all fresh, all identical, same size, shape, same orientation, like one person had touched everything. Vanessa's breath quickened. She walked faster toward the exit, her boots echoing on concrete. Behind her, the grinding started again. Closer, much closer. Vanessa broke into a run. She burst out of the building and into the open air, gasping. Her hands shook as she tried to control her breathing. Behind her, inside the building, the grinding continued, rhythmic, mechanical, relentless. Vanessa forced herself to turn around and look. The rusted saw blades inside the building were moving, not falling, not being pushed by wind or shifting debris, moving, spinning slowly, their teeth grinding against metal with a shriek that made Vanessa's skin crawl. But there was no power. The mill had been abandoned for 70 years. There were no electrical lines, no generators, no machinery capable of running, yet the blades spun. Vanessa pulled out her camera, her hands trembling. She raised it, framing the shot through her viewfinder. Through the camera's LCD screen, she saw something else. Figures, standing among the machinery, translucent and indistinct, but humanoid. 30, maybe 40 of them, arranged in rows as if working an invisible shift. They moved in synchronized motions, performing tasks only they could see, lifting phantom lumber, operating ghost machinery, working a mill that no longer existed. Vanessa lowered her camera. The figures vanished. She raised the camera again. The figures reappeared, clearer now. Men in work clothes from the 1940s, denim overalls, flannel shirts, flat caps, heavy boots. They moved mechanically, repeating the same motions over and over. Lift, carry, stack, return. Lift, carry, stack, return. One of them turned toward Vanessa. His face was burned, skin blackened and peeling, eyes empty sockets, mouth open in a silent scream. Vanessa dropped her camera. The lens shattered on the concrete. She ran. Vanessa sprinted through the mill ruins, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the grinding sound multiplied. Dozens of saws, all spinning, all shrieking in unison. She vaulted over a fallen beam, her ankle twisting painfully. She stumbled but kept running. The highway was ahead, maybe 200 yards. Her car was there. Safety. Vanessa glanced over her shoulder. The figures were following, not running, walking, but covering ground impossibly fast, gliding over obstacles as if they weren't there. 50 yards to her car, 30, 10. She reached it, fumbling with her keys. Her hands shook so violently she dropped them. She bent down, grabbed them, unlocked the door. The figures were 10 feet away. Vanessa threw herself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, locked it. She jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over. Once, twice, it didn't start. Vanessa looked up. The figures surrounded her car, dozens of them pressing against the windows, their burned faces inches from the glass. Vanessa screamed. She turned the key again, pumping the gas pedal. The engine roared to life. Vanessa threw the car into drive and floored it. The tires screeched. The car lurched forward, accelerating down the highway. In her rearview mirror, the figures stood on the road, motionless, watching, and then, one by one, they turned and walked back into the mill. Tyler Nguyen had been mountain biking competitively for 6 years. At 31, he'd raced downhill circuits across Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, placing in the top 10 at regional championships 3 years running. But competition had burned him out. Too much pressure, too many sponsors demanding content. By late 2019, Tyler had quit racing entirely and returned to what he loved most: raw, technical trail riding with no one watching. Oakridge was legendary in the mountain biking community. Over 350 miles of single-track trails winding through the old-growth forests and alpine terrain. The town branded itself the mountain biking capital of the Northwest, and for good reason. Trails like the Alpine Trail and Tire Mountain had appeared in mountain biking magazines and YouTube videos thousands of times. But Tyler wasn't interested in the popular routes. He wanted something challenging, technical, and most importantly, empty. Comet, the trail was rated Black Diamond, 12 miles of steep descents, rock gardens, and narrow berms cut into the mountainside. The post, from 2017, included a warning: incredibly technical, go with a buddy, cell service non-existent. Perfect. Tyler loaded his Specialized Enduro, a $7,000 carbon fiber downhill bike built for punishment, onto his truck and drove to Oakridge on November 21, 2019. He arrived at the Larison Rock Trailhead around 2:00 p.m. No other vehicles. The trail map posted at the kiosk showed a 12-mile loop with 2,800 feet of descent. Tyler checked his gear: full-face helmet, knee pads, elbow pads, hydration pack, multi-tool, spare tube, everything he needed. He clipped into his pedals and started climbing. The first 3 miles were uphill, a brutal grind on a single track so steep Tyler had to stand on his pedals the entire way, his quads burning. But that was the price of descent. You earned gravity. At the summit, Tyler paused to catch his breath. The view was spectacular, endless ridges of the Cascade Mountains disappearing into gray mist. 2 miles climbed, 1,847 feet of elevation gain. Heart rate, 168 BPM. Tyler adjusted his helmet, double-checked his brake levers, and dropped into the descent. The trail was perfect. Fast, technical, demanding total focus. Tyler carved through berms, his tires gripping the hard-packed dirt. He launched off small jumps, absorbing the impact with his legs. His front suspension compressed and rebounded as he hammered through rock gardens, the bike's geometry keeping him balanced. This was flow state, This was why Tyler rode. At mile 5, the trail narrowed. The trees pressed in closer, Douglas firs and hemlocks creating a tunnel of green. Tyler's speed increased as the grade steepened. His bike computer showed 28 mph, fast for technical terrain. And then the forest went silent. Tyler didn't notice immediately. His focus was on the trail, on reading the terrain 3 seconds ahead, on choosing lines through the obstacles. But gradually the absence of sound registered. No birds, no wind through branches, just the sound of his tires on dirt and his own breathing inside his helmet. Tyler slowed, sitting back on his saddle, dragging his brakes. He came to a stop and unclipped, putting one foot down. He lifted his helmet visor, listening. Nothing. Complete silence. Neither had ridden hundreds of trails. He knew forest sounds, birds, rustling undergrowth, distant water. This absence was unnatural, wrong. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Expected. He checked his GPS track. 3 miles from the summit, 7 miles to the trailhead. Tyler clipped back in and started pedaling. The silence persisted, pressing in on all sides like something physical. His tires seemed too loud now. Every crunch of dirt it amplified. The trail descended steeply. Tyler picked up speed, trying to shake the unease. 25 emp, 30 mph. His suspension worked overtime, absorbing hits from roots and rocks. The trees blurred past, and then Tyler saw the bike. It was lying in the middle of the trail, 50 yards ahead. A mountain bike, carbon fiber frame, high-end components, just lying there, like someone had dropped it and walked away. Tyler braked hard, his rear tire skidding. He stopped 10 feet from the bike and stared. The frame was intact, no crash damage, no bent wheels. The handlebars were straight. It looked like someone had carefully laid it down and walked off the trail. Tyler called out. His voice sounded muffled, dead, no response. Tyler dismounted and approached the bike slowly. It was a Santa Cruz Bronson, a $6,000 trail bike, newer than his own. The owner's name was written on the top tube in permanent marker, A. Tyler looked around. The trail ahead curved out of sight. Behind him, the trail disappeared into the trees. No sign of anyone. He pulled out his phone and took a photo of the bike. Then he remounted and continued down the trail, leaving the abandoned bike behind. Someone would come back for it. They had to. The trail steepened again. Tyler accelerated, his bike computer showing 32 mph. Too fast for this terrain, but Tyler needed to move, needed to get off this mountain. Behind him, he heard it. A bike. The unmistakable sound of tires on dirt. The rattle of suspension. The metallic click of a derailled wheel shifting. Someone was following him. Tyler glanced over his shoulder mid-descent. The trail behind him was empty, but he'd heard it, clearly. Another rider, close. Maybe 30 feet back. Tyler shouted, still pedaling. No response. But the sound continued. Tires, suspension, breathing. Tyler pushed harder, his legs burning. The trail twisted through tight switchbacks. Tyler leaned hard into each turn, his tires on the edge of losing grip. The sounds behind him matched his pace perfectly. When Tyler accelerated, the phantom rider accelerated. When Tyler braked for a corner, the sound slowed, but there was no one there. Tyler's heart hammered. His hands shook on the handlebars. 8 miles descended, 2 miles to the trailhead. The trail opened into a brief straight section. Tyler glanced back again. A figure was riding behind him. Not a person. Not quite. It was shaped like a rider, hunched over handlebars, legs pumping pedals, but its body was translucent like smoke, and it was gaining. Tyler screamed and pedaled harder. His quads burned. His lungs screamed for air. The bike computer showed 38 mph, dangerously fast for single track. Ahead, the trail dropped into a steep rock garden, a minefield of boulders and exposed roots. Tyler couldn't slow down. The thing behind him was too close. He committed. Tyler plunged into the rock garden, his bike bucking violently. His front wheel slammed into a rock. His rear tire skipped sideways. He was out of control, barely holding on, his body thrown forward over the handlebars. Somehow, Tyler stayed upright. He cleared the rock garden and accelerated again, his bike rattling beneath him. Behind him, the translucent rider followed effortlessly, gliding over obstacles that should have thrown it. Tyler's front tire hit a root. The bike jerked sideways. Tyler tried to correct, but his front wheel washed out. He slammed into the dirt, his body tumbling, his bike cartwheeling ahead. Tyler lay on the trail, gasping, his ribs screaming. His helmet had cracked. His knee pads were shredded, blood dripped from his elbow. The translucent rider stopped 20 feet away. It dismounted smoothly, its movements too fluid, too perfect. It walked toward Tyler, leaving no footprints in the dirt. Tyler scrambled backward, his hand finding a rock. He threw it. The rock passed through the figure and clattered into the trees. The figure stopped. It tilted its head, as if curious. Then it reached out one elongated, translucent hand. Tyler's bike computer beeped. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like static. Tyler looked at his wrist. His bike computer's backlight had turned on automatically, its screen glowing in the dim forest light. The figure retreated from the glow, its form destabilizing. Light, just like the photographer, just like all of them. Tyler forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain. He grabbed his bike, checking it frantically. The front wheel was bent. The fork was twisted. The bike was unrideable. Tyler turned on his phone's flashlight, aiming it at the figure. It dissolved in the mist, vanishing. Tyler ran. He left his bike and ran down the trail, his phone's light cutting through the forest. His ribs screamed with every step. His knee throbbed, but Tyler didn't stop. The trail seemed endless, but finally, Tyler saw the trailhead. His truck. Safety. He sprinted the last 100 yards, threw himself into his truck and locked the doors. His hands shook as he started the engine. In his rearview mirror, Tyler saw the figure standing at the trailhead entrance, watching. Then it turned and disappeared back into the forest. Tyler never rode in Oakridge again. 3 months later, a search and rescue team found his abandoned bike on Larison Rock Trail. They also found the Santa Cruz Bronson with Elise Torres written on the frame. Alfonso Torres had been reported missing in 2017. His body was never found. Sarah Winters had been solo camping since her divorce 3 years ago. At 38, she discovered that solitude in the wilderness was healing in ways therapy never managed. No kids, no ex-husband, no demanding job for 48 hours. Just her tent, a campfire, and the sound of wind through trees. Sarah had camped across the Pacific Northwest, Olympic National Park, Mount Rainier, the Oregon coast. In December 2019, she planned a solo winter camping trip to Oakridge. The town's tourism website advertised Blair Lake as a hidden gem, a small alpine lake surrounded by old-growth forest, with a primitive campground that stayed open year-round. The website didn't mention that Blair Lake Campground had no recent reviews, or that the Forest Service road leading to it hadn't been maintained in years, or that the campground host position had been vacant since 2015. Sarah arrived at Blair Lake on December 6th, a Friday afternoon. The drive up Forest Road 2408 took 40 minutes, her Subaru bouncing over potholes and fallen branches. When she finally reached the campground, she understood why it was empty. The place was abandoned. Not officially, the campground sign still stood, faded and tilted, but clearly neglected. 6 campsites, all overgrown with ferns and salal, rusted fire rings, a collapsed outhouse, a small dock extending into Blair Lake, its planks rotting and sagging, but the location was beautiful. The lake was glassy and calm, reflecting the gray sky. Forest pressed in on all sides, creating a sense of seclusion. Perfect. Sarah chose campsite number 3, closest to the lake. She set up her 4-season tent, arranged her sleeping bag and pad, and built a fire in the rusted ring. By 5 p.m., darkness had fallen. Winter solstice was only 2 weeks away, and the sun set early this far north. Sarah cooked dinner over the fire, freeze-dried chili rehydrated with boiling water. She ate slowly, watching the flames, listening to the forest. Owls called in the distance. The lake lapped gently against the shore. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. At 8 p.m., Sarah heard the footsteps. The sound was distinct. Boots on gravel, coming from the direction of the campground entrance. Sarah looked up from her fire, expecting to see another camper. Maybe someone else looking for solitude, but the footsteps stopped at the edge of her campsite, just beyond the reach of her firelight. Sarah called out. Her voice sounded small in the vast darkness. No response. Sarah stood, grabbing her flashlight. She aimed the beam toward the footsteps. The light revealed nothing, just trees, ferns, darkness. "I heard you," Sarah said, louder now. "If you're lost, I can help. If you're just passing through, that's fine." Silence. Then the footsteps resumed, circling her campsite. Slowly, deliberately, always staying just beyond the light. Sarah's heart began to race. She reached into her tent and pulled out her bear spray, a canister of capsaicin powerful enough to stop a grizzly. She held it ready, her thumb on the safety tab. "I'm armed," Sarah lied, her voice shaking. "I have a gun." The footsteps stopped. Sarah waited, her breath misting in the cold air. 10 seconds, 20, 30, then the footsteps resumed. Faster now, running, circling her campsite in rapid loops, the sound coming from all directions at once. Sarah spun, trying to track the sound, her flashlight beam cutting uselessly through the darkness. The footsteps were everywhere, left, right, behind her, in front, impossible to pin down. And then they stopped. Complete silence. Sarah stood frozen, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She scanned the darkness, her finger on the bear spray trigger. A face appeared at the edge of her firelight. It was translucent, barely visible, like smoke given form. No features, just the suggestion of a face, hollow and watching. It tilted its head, as if studying her. Sarah screamed and sprayed. The bear spray passed through the face harmlessly. The figure didn't react. It just watched. Sarah stumbled backward, tripping over her tense guy line. She fell hard, her flashlight flying from her hand. The beam spun crazily, illuminating the trees in rapid flashes. And in those flashes, Sarah saw them. Dozens of translucent figures standing at the edge of her campsite, surrounding her, all watching in perfect silence. Sarah scrambled to her feet, grabbed her flashlight, and ran toward her car. Her Subaru was parked 50 yards away, at the edge of the campground. She sprinted through the darkness, branches whipping her face. Behind her, the figures followed. Not running, just walking, but covering ground impossibly fast, gliding over obstacles. Sarah reached her car and fumbled with her keys. Her hands shook so violently she dropped them. She bent down, grabbed them, unlocked the door. The figures stopped 10 feet away, a wall of translucent bodies blocking her escape route. Sarah got in her car and locked the doors. She turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, and died. Sarah tried again. Click, click, dead battery. Impossible. She'd just driven here hours ago. She looked out her windshield. The figures pressed closer, their translucent forms clustering around the car. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Sarah's phone lit up on the passenger seat. She grabbed it. No signal, but a text message had somehow come through. "Stay in the car." Sarah stared at the message. There was no sender, no number, just those words. She had no choice. Running was suicide. Her car wouldn't start. Her tent was back at the campsite, surrounded. Sarah locked all the doors, reclined her seat, and waited. The figures didn't leave. They stood around Sarah's car in concentric circles, motionless, their translucent forms barely visible in the darkness. Sarah kept her flashlight on, aimed out the windshield. The beam seemed to hold them at bay, keeping them from pressing closer. At 11:00 p.m., Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another text. "They died here, 1962, logging accident." Sarah's blood ran cold. 1962, the same year as the mill fire, the same year the Forager had found bodies in the dead Fir Grove. Another text appeared. "Blair Lake isn't a lake, it's a reservoir. They flooded the valley to build it." Sarah looked out at the lake, black and still in the darkness. A reservoir, built over a mass grave. Another text. "They come out at night, every night." Sarah's hands shook. She whispered to the phone. Sarah dropped the phone. She pressed herself against the driver's seat, her heart hammering. Outside, the figures had moved closer. Their faces, if they had faces, were inches from her windows, pressing against the glass. Sarah turned on her car's interior lights. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering. Light. They hated light. Sarah kept every light in the car on. Headlights, interior lights, even the hazards. Her battery would die eventually, but maybe it would last until dawn. The hours crawled past. Midnight. 1:00 a.m. 2:00 a.m. Sarah didn't sleep. She couldn't. The figures never left. They stood at the edge of the light, waiting. At 3:47 a.m., Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. Sunrise at 7:32 a.m. When the sun hits the lake drive, don't stop. Sarah nodded. Even though no one could see her, she waited. At 7:00 a.m., the sky began to lighten, from black to deep blue to gray. The figures grew fainter, their translucent forms dissolving in the growing light. At 7:32 a.m., the sun crested the ridgeline. Its rays struck Blair Lake, turning the water gold. The figures vanished instantly. Sarah turned the key. The engine roared to life. She threw the car into drive and floored it, her tires sprinting on gravel. She didn't look back. She didn't stop until she reached Highway 58, 40 miles away. Sarah drove straight through Oakridge without stopping. She didn't stop in Eugene. She drove all the way to Portland, 3 hours away, before finally pulling into a gas station. Her hands were still shaking. Her phone was dead. When she got home and charged her phone, Sarah scrolled through her messages. Sarah researched Blair Lake. She found a brief mention in a 1963 Oregon State Forestry document. Blair Lake Reservoir completed. Flooded former logging campsite. Operation suspended following discovery of structural remains and unidentified remains. Unidentified remains. 47 men, 1962. Sarah never went camping alone again, and 6 months later, when she heard about a trail runner, a photographer, a forager, a kayaker, and an urban explorer, all reporting similar encounters in Oakridge, she wasn't surprised. She knew the truth. Oakridge wasn't haunted by one tragedy, it was haunted by many, and the forest remembered all of them. 7 people, 7 different hobbies, 7 encounters with something that shouldn't exist. Jake, the trail runner who ran in circles for 2 hours but only covered 6 miles. Elise, the photographer who captured translucent figures through her lens, figures that recoiled from light. Marcus, the forager who found a mass grave in the dead Fir Grove, where mushrooms grew from skeletal remains. David, the kayaker who discovered what lives beneath Salmon Creek Reservoir, a shadow with hundreds of eyes. Vanessa, the urban explorer who watched the mill's dead workers continue their shifts 70 years after they burned alive. Tyler, the mountain biker chased by a phantom rider on a trail where bikes are found abandoned, their owners never located. And Sarah, the camper who spent a night surrounded by translucent figures at Blair Lake, a reservoir built over a flooded logging camp where 47 men died, all of them within 5 miles of Oakridge's town center, all of them between 2017 and 2019. All of them experienced the same thing. The forest went silent. Something started following them, and light was the only thing that kept the entities at bay. This isn't coincidence. This is pattern. When you map the 7 locations, Tire Mountain Trail, Kitson Hot Springs Road, Dead Fir Grove, Salmon Creek Reservoir, the Old Mill Ruins, Larison Rock Trail, and Blair Lake, they form a rough circle around Oakridge, a 5-mile radius centered on the town itself, and within that circle, at least 121 people have died in 3 separate tragedies. November 18, 1947, Cascade Timber Company mill fire. 37 workers burned to death, trapped behind fallen timber stacks. Survivors reported hearing screams for hours after the fire started. June 14, 1962, Blair Lake logging camp accident. 47 men killed when a dam breach flooded the valley overnight. The camp was buried under 60 feet of water. The reservoir that formed was named Blair Lake. Their bodies were never recovered. October 3, 1991, Dead Fir Grove incident. 47 Douglas fir trees died overnight in a perfect circle. No disease, no logging, no explanation. Forest Service reports classified the event as unexplained die-off and closed the investigation after 3 months. 3 tragedies, same area, same number of deaths in 1962 and 1991. 47, the same number of translucent figures Sarah saw surrounding her car at Blair Lake. The locals in Oakridge don't talk about this openly, but they know, they've always known. They avoid certain trails. They don't camp at Blair Lake. They don't explore the mill ruins. Because silence is the warning. Silence is the signal that something ancient, something patient, something tied to this land through death and fire and water is paying attention. The translucent figures aren't ghosts. They're not spirits of the dead. They're something else, something that existed before the tragedies and fed on them, something that uses the shapes of the dead to lure the living, and they're still hunting. Between 1989 and 2019, 23 people have been reported missing in the Oakridge area. Hikers, campers, photographers, foragers, mountain bikers, all pursuing outdoor hobbies in what should be safe, well-trafficked areas of the Willamette National Forest. Some of their gear was found, boots on trails, tents left set up, bikes lying in the middle of paths, but the people themselves, gone. But the locals know better. The forest isn't just dangerous, it's awake, it's aware, and it remembers every death that's ever happened within its boundaries. Jake still hears footsteps behind him when he runs city streets at night. Elise sold all her camera equipment and moved to New York. Marcus never foraged again. David won't go near water. Vanessa quit urban exploration entirely. Tyler's bike still sits in his garage, untouched. And Sarah? She only camps in crowded RV parks now, surrounded by people and lights. They escaped, but they're not free, because once the forest marks you, once it follows you, once it learns your rhythm, it never fully lets go. If you're planning an outdoor adventure in Oregon, be careful. Check your maps, research your locations, and if someone warns you about a specific trail, a specific lake, a specific grove of dead trees, listen to them, because the people who live in small mountain towns know things that Google can't tell you. They know which places are safe and which places are waiting. Oakridge, Oregon, population 3,148, the mountain biking capital of the Northwest, a logging town with a dark history and a forest that never forgets. 7 people went into that forest pursuing their hobbies. 7 people came back changed. 23 others never came back at all. If you visit Oakridge, remember this: when the forest goes silent, you have 2 choices: run toward light, or become another translucent figure standing at the edge of someone else's campsite, watching, waiting, hunting for the next person who ignores the warnings. Thanks for watching Barefax Docs. If this episode kept you up at night, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into America's small towns every week, uncovering the horror that hides in plain sight. And remember, some places should be left alone,